Hello and welcome back to Widowed AF. You're here with your host Rosie Gill Moss, and joining me today I have got Emma Gray. Welcome to the podcast, Emma.
Oh, thanks, Rosie.
So Emma was widowed back in 2016 and your husband Simon died from esophagus cancer, is that right?
Yeah, that's right.
And you had two young girls. I mean, they were young at the time, they're obviously a little bit older now. So I'm really interested in listening to you talk about your story and Simon and your relationship, and you know, obviously I have a kind of invested interest in how we talk to children about death. So really excited to hear your story, Emma. So I'm going to shut up and let you tell your story.
Yeah, well, 2016, in some respects, it seems like yesterday, and in other respects, it seems like such a long time ago. So when people ask me to open up, sometimes I'm a bit like, gosh, how far back do I start? And I think it's relevant to start when I met Simon in some respects, because I met a young officer in training, and he was trained to be a Royal Marines officer. And bizarrely, my anxiety went through the roof when I met him. I just had a funny feeling that we would be together for as long as we could be together, but that our time together might be limited. He loved adrenaline. He loved crazy sports and things like that. And I just had a sixth sense. So when he went to Afghanistan I don't know, he went away so much, probably about 2010-ish. I had a horrible feeling I was never going to see him again. And ironically, I was a Wilson probate lawyer, so I did death and dying as a job. So we were always pretty sorted, you know, notwithstanding any neurodivergence issues and all the rest of it, which I'm sure we might mention. But you know, we were as sorted as we possibly could be, because death was sadly quite a possibility. You know, Simon would bump up his life insurance quite significantly every time he went away with the Marines. And then he would bump it back down again when he came home because the premiums were so high. And then he would try and tell me that he was safe. And I'm like, don't know if I want to talk about this, because I'm sure you wouldn't be paying a fortune in insurance premiums if you thought you were safe. So let's just not talk about that.
So interesting, my dad was a war correspondent. So although he wasn't in the military, he spent quite a lot of his career going out to Afghanistan and places like this. And I do remember one of the kind of really jarring moments was he had to shave his beard off. He'd had a beard all his life, and it was to wear a gas mask out there. And I just remember my mum that was the only time I really saw my mum not want him to go. And it's that sort of, oh, you are going out somewhere pretty scary, aren't you?
Yeah, and the scary moment for me is that, do you know, even just talking about it, Rosie, gives me goosebumps. But Simon did some stuff, and he wouldn't tell me where he was, which was kind of run of the mill. And I've got quite a big mouth, and I can't help it. I spontaneously. I know you laugh. I spontaneously say stuff and then regret it afterwards, thinking, "Oh, why did that come out? Why did I think that was appropriate?"
Very familiar, Emma.
Yeah, well, do you know, I used to think I'd be an amazing spy because I'm such a big mouth. I'm the last person anyone would think of as being a spy. But no, so the thing that he used to leave behind that used to haunt me is when he was going away to do really risky stuff and there's a chance that he might get caught and all the rest of it, he'd leave anything that identified him as being with someone else. So his wedding ring, he used to initially leave it by the side of the bed. And I was like, seriously, like, can you just hide it? Because that's like in my face. Like, you don't want me in your world anymore. That really hurts. But he did tell me it was for my own safety. But anyway, but yeah, no. So in 2013, he started to have funny kind of back pain and a few issues swallowing. And the backstory is quite lengthy, but I do remember in February 2013 we went away to Egypt as a family, and he'd been working ridiculously hard. I mean, we'd made the decision that although I was a solicitor, his job was the main job, as it were. So he would put his all into his jobs, and you know, so the wife worked, paid for the holidays, kind of thing. And I remember on that holiday distinctly him saying that it was a relief not to feel like he was always in pain. And throughout 2013, we had a number of quite heated conversations. We never really argued. But I would say to him, a little bit like a mum with a sick kid, like, they haven't got it right. The doctors just haven't got it right. They told him he might have glorified reflux. They told him maybe he was working too hard. He was a Marine, like he was trained to not sleep and work really hard. And then they said that maybe he had ulcers. And I was like, seriously, I've never met anyone more chilled out in my whole entire life. I just had like a sixth sense that there was something not quite right. And we did actually have a couple of discussions where he threatened to not go to the doctors if I kept pushing him so hard. And I was just like, oh my gosh, like I can't win. Like, I don't know what to do. And he was like, do you know what it's like for a Royal Marine to walk into the medical centre? I was like, I don't care what it's like for a Royal Marine to walk into the medical centre. You're really sick and you need to see a doctor. Somebody needs to. And in the end, I took him to A&E in kind of November-ish time. And then A&E was the first time they mentioned cancer to us as one of like 3 different options as to what could be wrong. But even then, as we left A&E, the nurse was like, so you need an endoscopy. And he was like, well, I've got to go to work. I was like, seriously, Simon? And so as we left, and he basically discharged himself because they wanted him to stay in over the weekend so he could have an endoscopy on the Monday morning, but he wanted to go back to work in London. He was working in London at the time. And in the end, they said, well, you can take a letter. And no, they said, we can make a referral to your GP, but you must make sure first thing that this is really serious. And as we were leaving, I turned around to him and I went, do they know the military doctors? Like, do they know where they're actually referring this urgent endoscopy referral to? And he was like, well, I don't know. And I ran back into the lady and I was like, I'm really sorry. I know you thought you got rid of us, but do you actually know where you're making this referral to? And she looked on the system and she said, oh, there's nobody there. I'm like, oh, for crying out loud. Okay, so he's in the military. So if you want this done really urgently, you're going to have to make sure you send it to the military doctors. He's currently in London. And in the end, they wrote a letter for him to take to his military doctor on the Monday morning. And then they were really cross with him because he kept going away and going abroad. And so he was away when he should have been within the cancer, like, have your tests in this kind of period. And finally, in December 2013, they called him in to oncology to have his results, at which point I got a phone call. So they want me to go in for the results. I kind of said that I could take the padre because they said that really it would be good if I took somebody else. And I was there, like, sat at home in Devon, just thinking, well, I'm a bit upset. Like, why aren't you asking me to come? And he's like, well, I thought you've got the kids and this is probably nothing, so you don't need to worry about it. But the nurse did say, do you have a wife? He's like, oh, yes, I have one. Like, seriously? Like, this... Like, I had a gut feel this was really serious, and he was just adamant that he was going to be okay.
He just wasn't having it. You can hear it. He just wasn't having that this was going to be serious at all.
And his body was his life, like he needed to be fighting fit to cycle the entire route of the Tour de France at the same time frame as the professionals, to do the commando course, to ski off the side of a mountain, to do all the kind of crazy stuff that he used to like doing. He needed his body. So I think he was probably in denial. And so I drove to London, got childcare for the kids, and picked him up. And he was in quite a state. We went to have bite to eat for lunch, but his tumour was so bad in his esophagus he could only have soup. He couldn't eat solid food. It wouldn't go past his tumour. And he loved sandwiches. I can't tell you how sad he was. He couldn't eat bread. And we walked past the wig shop to go into oncology to get the results, and he was still telling me that it might just be glorified reflux. It's just like, oh my goodness. His face, he'd had a PET scan. Oh my God, but he'd had so much, Rosie. He'd had a PET scan, CT scan, blood done, endoscopy, biopsy taken. I'd spoken to my sister, who's a medic, and said, would they do these for anything other than cancer? And she said, no, they're just trying to work out how bad the cancer is. So I kind of already knew, but I felt like I needed to know to be able to hold for him. So I will never forget, after that, they told us he had esophageal cancer. They thought it was in the lymph nodes next to his primary tumour. And his primary tumour was really far down, where the esophagus meets the stomach at that joining by the valve. And And they did explain that sometimes with esophageal cancer, you can do an operation and take the whole tumour out. But because it's where his valve was, then it would make it hard. And he'd probably have reflux problems for the rest of his life. But there was also like another operation that they needed to do to see if it had spread to the lining of his stomach. And it's fascinating how two people can be at the same appointment, Rosie, and hear different things. So he and I were at the same appointment, and as we came out and walked down the corridor, I was thinking, oh my God, he's going to die. Like, my worst fears are true. And he turned round and said, thank you for taking me to A&E. I think you saved my life.
Oh my goodness.
And I knew I hadn't. I knew I'd done everything I could, but I knew that I hadn't. And then because his eating was so bad at that stage, we had to go to see the dietitian, and we waited on these little plastic chairs in the hospital corridor. And I can't remember why there was nobody around. I don't know whether it was late in the evening, but it felt like we were on our own in the hospital. And he turned around and he said, you know, I'm going to fight this. I'm going to do everything I can and I'm going to beat it. And I was there just thinking, I don't think you heard the doctor. I don't think you heard what they said. Anyway, we then got transferred to Exeter because that was our local hospital. But oh my gosh, we went back to the officer's mess and it was just so surreal. Like, we'd heard this news, yet we went back to an environment with some of the fittest and healthiest men and women around, and walked in to have supper and seemingly sat down next to someone I've never met before, who was asking me kind of about the weather. And I was kind of sat there thinking, you've got no idea that this man next to me is like on a ticking time bomb. And we then cleared his room of everything, and it was raining, and it was horrendous. It was just, he was supposed to do a 2-week handover, and the next day he did a 2-day handover. I drove back to Devon, unpacked the car because I knew how horrendous it would be for the children or for him to see all his stuff in the car, and scattered it around the house so that people wouldn't really know. And then I went to work for the afternoon, as you do.
Well, I mean, this is the thing. We do some very strange things when we're under enormous pressure, don't we? So is this kind of the end of his I mean, obviously it's cancer, but it's the end of his military career, which is kind of, I guess, the first step in his life beginning to disband and kind of fall apart.
Yeah, we were so lucky, Rosie. I can't tell you. So the Royal Marines were amazing. And I think also he didn't want people to know. I mean, obviously he told work how serious it was. And that, I have to say, you know how sometimes you don't hear how serious it is until it's put into a language you understand. And it wasn't until that evening back at the officers' mess when he had to report back to the medical doctor, and the medical officer put him down as P0. And anyone who's military knows that they like identify the individual and how bad they are as like walking wounded or what have you. And P0 is as bad as it gets without being dead, basically. And hearing that to him, I could just sense the shivers on the back of my neck. Like, to him, suddenly that meant something. And then when we got back to Devon, we got given a visiting officer. Now, visiting officers only happen for people who are really poorly too. And again, it was just like, in military terms, hearing how poorly he was like a real shock. But you know, to the outside eye, other than the eating, he was still fit and able. And because he was an officer and because he did some big projects, he was adamant he still wanted to do his work and that he could still do his work. So hearing what had happened in like a military sense, I think for him was massive. But the Royal Marines were amazing. And because he was so seemingly fit and able, and because to him, his job was his purpose. It was like, I mean, before he got sick, he had no idea what he'd be if he wasn't a Royal Marine. And he did kind of projects. So they managed to find him jobs that he could do. And both his work and my work were amazing throughout. They were just absolutely brilliant. And I think having understanding from employers does make a phenomenal difference. I think it really, really does. But we were launched straight into Exeter Oncology, and it was fascinating. I will never forget the doctor turning around to Simon and saying, "So what do you understand is going on?" And that was fascinating because obviously he said, "Oh, I have esophageal cancer, but you can do an operation and then I'll be better." And she must have gauged from that he needed to see to believe. So um, she took him to the computer and actually showed him his scan pictures and was like, "Your primary tumor is here. The lymph nodes here, they don't look great. I actually think you might have a patch by your heart here. So this extra operation we need to do, it's not just looking at the lining of your stomach. It's also maybe taking a biopsy." And of course, it was Christmas time. So we then had like every day before Christmas. I mean, it would be, wouldn't it? Then every day around Christmas, we had Christmas Day and Boxing Day off, and we went down to Cornwall for those with my family. And then the next day, Simon went to the hospital, had this operation, but he knew when he woke up that if he had loads of drains in him and stuff, then they'd blown up his tummy with a laparoscopy, seen that it was clear of cancer, and then they'd gone into his chest to take a biopsy of the patch by his heart. But if he woke up and he had nothing on him and he was just sewn back up from the laparoscopy, then he knew that it was terminal and there was nothing they could do. And he woke up and refused to talk to anyone. And I got a phone call from the nurse saying, "Mrs. Gray, are you on your way?" And I was like, I can still see it, Rosie, like it was yesterday. But I could see the hospital building. I was like, I'm nearly there. Like, children were a bit slower to get sorted this morning and all the rest of it. And they said, "Well, you need to be here because your husband's refusing to talk to anyone until you get here." And then that's where they said, "You've got esophageal cancer. We'll do what we can. We'll try and shrink it back, but this is it for you." And then he had chemotherapy, consolidation radiotherapy, and they actually managed to not just, and this is why he managed to keep working, I think, but they managed to not just stop it, but they shrunk it back. So he almost had a normal sized esophagus. So he was able to do so much. And actually, he'd just been promoted. So he was due to go on an educational course. So he went on the course and he was disappointed. He got a merit, not a distinction. I was like, "You're living with a terminal cancer and you're disappointed with your grade." Like, seriously?
Could he eat sandwiches though?
He still wasn't great with bread, and he still had to watch what he ate. So yeah, that was still really hard. And but it gave us is a gift of a bit of time with the children. And we did some stuff because they were 3 and 5 when he was diagnosed, Rosie. So we went to Euro Disney and we took them skiing, and shamelessly, because we didn't have a lot of spare cash, we just took advantage of any charity that was willing to try and help us out. And I would say to other people, the charities are out there to do that good, to give you those memories. And I've raised far more money than what I took off them since then, but I will be forever grateful.
It's interesting to hear you refer to it as a gift, because actually it's quite a common theme that I'm getting from these conversations, is the idea that yes, it is awful watching somebody you love suffer and have their life taken out of them, bit by bit. But you do get to do these kind of crazy things like take the kids skiing, go to Disney, tell them all the really important things that you want to tell them. And I think it speaks volumes about the kind of people that I have on this podcast, that they are able to flip this terrible thing that's happened to them and say, "I did get this gift. I was able to spend time with them and tell them what I needed to." And I do think it speaks volumes about the kind of people that come onto this podcast.
Yeah, I think it really does. And I think it really shows you how to find courage in adversity, how to find bravery and the ability to keep going. And I don't know whether some of that comes from the Royal Marine ethos, because cheerfulness in the face of adversity is like one of the Royal Marine like core beliefs. And you know, I always used to laugh that if I was a Royal Marine and I was cold, wet, and miserable, Simon would be who I'd want by my side, and not for any romantic philosophy, but purely because he was epitomizing cheerfulness in adversity. He was inspirational in the way that, and he did everything he possibly could for as long as he could. He did everything he could to live his normal life, so to work, so that he knew that if he died in service financially, it was very different for if he hadn't. So
Mhm.
it to me at one point it was hard to watch, because I could see he was hurting going to work, but he wanted to do his job, and he wanted it to do it to the level that he was doing it before, and adding value like he was before, so that it made it worthwhile. And then when it came towards the end, I cannot tell you, Rosie, the amount of stuff that he did. He did a lot of kind of death cleaning, if you were. So he sold his like amazing bike wheels. And it was things like that that made me realize that he knew he wasn't getting better, because on the surface he was in denial and he didn't want people to know it. Yet he was selling stuff that I mean, those bike wheels he were outrageously expensive, because I remember we had no money to buy nice things like holidays, and he was buying a freaking set of wheels.
But you got nice bike wheels.
Um, but um, but I remember it really clearly, because to me it was like him saying to himself, I can't keep going. And that money was actually, that he bought the bike wheels from, was actually the extra cash he got from Afghanistan. So I remembered it really clearly. um but then also, you know, we looked at our will and we changed guardianship provision in our will, and we did it together, so that I always knew that I'd talk to him about it, and if anything were to happen to me, he knew. He did letters. He did letters for people to open when when he died, not just to me, and but also to his parents and to his sister. He did birthday cards for the children for their first birthday after he died, then for their 13th, because he thought becoming a teenager was a really big deal. Then they've got 18 and 21, and they've got a letter to read at some point. Um, I can decide when I give it to them, and something for when they get married. And I will never forget, because he started to run out of time towards the end, and he wanted to handwrite everything. It was really important, but he couldn't. He was too poorly towards the end, because we had our bucket list, and then they re-challenged him with the same chemotherapy when he started to struggle swallowing and stuff again, and it was all going a bit wrong. And then they gave him interior radiotherapy, and then he had antibody drugs. So I mean, he really did throw everything he could at it. Um, but he also left gifts. So he did video blogs for the kids, especially with his career, of what he could share about what he'd done in the military and the countries he'd been to and the places he'd gone. He sorted out photos and got photos. He did memory boxes, and the memory boxes are beautiful in themselves, because he got, and I asked for one as well. I was like, I want a piece of this too. So he got three, one for me and one for each of the kids. And they're these beautiful wooden boxes, and on the top has our name in the middle, and then round our name is adjectives that he thinks of when he thinks of us. So I mean,
Oh my
oh
goodness.
my gosh, he then got his hair cut, and he got little bits of his hair put with forget-me-nots, and got lockets and a key rings made for key people in his life. I mean, he really didn't want to be forgotten, but he was so sorted.
No. And you can hear this sort of the enormous vulnerability when he was told, you know, that he just literally shut down, almost like a child. I don't want to talk about it. I'm, you know, he was scared, I guess. And then he's gone into this wonderful sort of provider mode, where he just wants to make sure that the people he loves behind are given this. I mean, not that you'd ever forget him, but I think in that moment, the fear of being forgotten must be enormous, and also to know that these big transitional points for his daughters were going to be huge. And my eldest son turned 13 this month, and last month, sorry, and it was actually enormous. And I wrote a card to him, kind of from what I thought his dad would say to him, because it felt very important, that transition into, adolescence. And
Yeah.
I think it's wonderful that he did all this. What a lovely, lovely man.
Yeah. And, it was pretty much the only times I ever saw him cry. He had tears in his eyes the day we got married. But other than that, the only times I saw him cry were thinking of us living without him, and
Yeah.
and him maybe being
Yeah.
forgotten. And but to me it just seemed ridiculous, because there's no way we would forget him. Do you know what I mean? Like, no matter what happens in your life and who else comes into your world, I think the death of someone is very different from a breakup. A breakup is a very conscious
Oh,
decision
completely.
that you don't want someone in your world, isn't it? Whereas when someone dies, you never stop loving them.
No. No, and it is a really difficult concept to get your head around. And had somebody said to me, 6 months into being widowed, oh, you're going to end up remarried and you're going to be happy and your life's actually going to be all right, I probably would have slapped them, because it would have felt so
Yeah.
completely abhorrent to me, because how on earth would that work? But we've referred to it in the podcast about being a little bit like when you have another child, that your heart expands. But the core part of you that is connected to them, that never goes. I feel so connected to Ben, and I always will. I never got divorced from him. He's still my husband. He's just not here.
Yeah. And I always used to say that anyone who came into my world would have to have big balls, because they've got to realise that Simon's going. But I too, to be honest, within the first 24 hours, somebody turned around and said it was okay for me because I'd find someone else. I genuinely think it came from a good place. But Rosie, it made me feel sick. Like, it literally made me feel sick. At the time,
Mm.
I thought I would be single forever, and like, a bit like you, I went to the most amazing, the Royal Marines every year do this amazing concert in the Royal Albert Hall called the Mountbatten Festival of Music. And I went there in March, and I was sat there in my new world, very happy that I was with the people I was with and all the rest of it. But I was crying my eyes out because Simon was dead. And you just do.
Yeah.
They're both there side by side,
Yeah.
aren't they?
And anybody that is going to be in our life, be it a friend, a partner, whoever it is, they meet this version of us that is slightly broken. I like the is it the Japanese that fill the cracks with gold? I could probably do with injecting with a bit of gold. But it is who we are, and nothing we're not the same people anymore. We are changed beyond recognition, and it's not always for the bad, actually, because I learned how strong I am. I wish I hadn't had to, but it pushed me. It's like being under some enormous stress test, isn't it, to see if you break. I'm
Yeah.
sorry, I just wanted to ask you, if you don't mind answering, just if and only feel comfortable talking about it. And it was just about the very end, who he had with him and where he died. But obviously, this is very personal.
Yeah, no, I don't mind sharing it at all. And I actually think it's really important to share, because I didn't realise until the last 24 hours that I was worried about something that I'd not named, was that I had very sadly witnessed someone in a horse riding accident fall off and have a very nasty death. Um, Very nasty death. And I don't think that'll ever leave me. But I think people just don't witness people dying in today's day and age. Thankfully, it's not a particularly nice thing, and I wouldn't wish it on anybody. So I could see that he was sleeping more, and he'd gone in. I was the only person who ever found him, Rosie, in 10 out of 10 of pain. I don't know whether that was a coincidence or whether he knew I could cope with it, or what. And one of those instances, we phoned the doctors in the middle of the night, and they actually didn't know what to do because they didn't know the drugs as well as I did. So I phoned the consultant in the morning. And the consultant, because I'm a lawyer, I'd written everything down, the timings and the quantities and everything. And the consultant said, "So how did you know to do this?" I said, "Well, he's got a hospice nurse who visits us at home occasionally, and she's been, helping us with the meds, and I've just been learning as I go along, really." And he said, "But the quantities that you gave, like, how did you know what to do?" And I said, "Well, I was basically given a formula." And I felt like a naughty school child who was about to be told off. I was
Mm.
like, "Oh my God, what have I done?" Like, something's my fault. There's going to be some horrible consequence of this. And
especially dealing with these very strong pain meds as well, you sort of
yeah,
almost feel like you're originally.
and I knew that most of the drugs like had to be under lock and key in the pharmacy. So I knew they were really potent, and I knew that the kids couldn't be anywhere near them. And Simon was still in the bed, and I was in the bedroom at the end of the bed, standing up, just chatting to the consultant. And I was like, he seems better. He seems like he's not in so much pain. He's able to sleep now. And the consultant said, do you know that most nurses wouldn't have done what you did? And I was like, trying to work out what he was saying. And he said, you've given your husband enough drugs to kill him. And I was like, oh my God. And he said, but it was entirely the right thing to do, because he's got so used to them that if you didn't give him that amount, it wouldn't have touched it. And I can't tell you, Rosie, I physically collapsed into a heap on the floor in the bedroom and started to burst out into tears. And that's when I realized how serious it had got. I was like, this is beyond my capabilities. I can't keep managing this. And so the second time he hit 10 out of 10 in pain. And when he did, he was a Royal Marine and he had a high pain threshold. And when he did, he was curled up in the fetal position. He couldn't even reach for his own drugs or anything. And he was really good with his pills and his medicines and all the rest of it. And again, this time it was the military doc who came. Bless him. If it had been a gunshot, I'm sure he would have been amazing and he would have been all over it. But with cancer, and also the kind of cancer that generally is an old man's cancer, really, esophageal cancer, I think he was slightly out of his depth. And because I do death and dying as a job, I turned around to Simon and I said, I think you need to go to the hospice. And I can't tell you, Rosie, the look on the doc's face was just blank. And Simon turned around to me like a frightened child and said, I'm not ready to die. And I was like, no, I'm not sending you to die. These guys are experts at pain control.
Yeah.
And they can watch you 24/7, and they can tweak what you're getting, and they can hopefully send you home again on a different regime. And so the first time he went into hospice, that's exactly what, and we started to call them symptom control experts rather than hospice.
Nice, I like.
And in there, and it's what they did for him. They watched him and they monitored and they tweaked and they changed and they gave him a subcut thing so it went directly into him, and so he came home with a line in him and stuff like that. But they can get rid of the pain. And then the second time he was in the hospice, and he was adamant he was going to do the same again and come home. And you know how you go into coping work mode? I don't know whether you do, but I totally do. Like I shut off to my own feelings, and I'm like, so he wants to come home. So in my head, I've already thought about my biggest fear is what happens if he dies when I'm asleep. Like that, I don't know why, but I'm a really heavy sleeper, and I thought, oh my God, can you imagine? And I missed it. Like don't think I'd ever forgive myself. But then my brain automatically went to, because it's slightly crazy, like, what would I tell the kids? Because I'd have to try and get some stranger to come in, and we'd have to remove the body. And so I went to the hospice nurse, and I was like, right, I need to talk to you. So this is my fear, and this is my plan, and this is what I'm going to do, and this is what I'm going to tell the children. This is how we're going to get Simon home, and Simon's going to do what Simon wants to do, and he's going to die at home. And the lady just looked at me and she went, if the children can't wake you on Sunday morning, what are you going to say to them? And I was like, oh, I don't want him to die at home. I don't want him to die at home anymore. I don't want him to die at home. I really, really, really don't want him to die at home. And then I was like, oh my God, so how do I do this? Like, how do I talk to he was in his 30s, a young chap who life has been taken away from him, and the one thing that he wants to do is die at home, and I don't want him to do it. I was like, I just don't know what to do. And so I did, Rosie, what I've always done with him, which is I sowed the seed of the problem, and I sowed the seed of the possible solution, which was staying with me, and I just left it with him. And I say this with a smile, because when he asked me to marry him, he turned around and he said, I've got a real problem, Em. I don't know who to have as my best man. I was like, why? What's the problem? He said, well, I want Skinny, but I also want Jamie. I said, well, have two. And he said, I can't do that. It's like, it's your wedding. You can do what the hell you want. Just fucking have two. It's fine. It's like, oh, I don't know. And then about 3 months later, and Rosie, I had totally forgotten about that conversation. He phoned me up, because in the military, you're often not together. He phoned me up all excited. I've had this most amazing idea. And my brain was somewhere totally different. He's like, I'm going to have two best men. Well done, love.
Brilliant. I love this. I like this plant seed of suggestion into the men in my life as well. It works quite well sometimes. Not always, but sometimes.
And so I did the same with the hospice, and I just said, look, I want it to be what's right for you, and it feels incredibly wrong if it's not what's right for you. But I did have this conversation with the hospice nurse, and this is what she said, and I left it with him for a few days, and then he said, I think I want to die in here. So he was then in the hospice, but then bizarrely, he almost started to look too well for the hospice, which is strange because he did look a bit like a POW victim. Like he was very skinny, and his teeth and his ears and everything seemed too big for him. But there was still him inside. The cancer never went to his head. So, and I used to prep people. I mean, honestly, I think the nurses in the hospice loved it because the amount of Royal Marines who went to visit him, they were like, oh, you father, we haven't had such a popular patient in here for a while. And we actually had to monitor the patients and the visitors because there was almost too many of them at one point, and Simon was getting too tired.
I was going to say, did he struggle with energy? Because I've heard this a lot, as well as, everybody wants to come and see them, but you almost have to then become the caretaker of their time because you don't want them to get so tired from seeing other people that they haven't got enough left for you and the children. It must be very difficult to manage that.
Yeah, so by the end, I think his concentration was about 20 minutes, and then he'd just drop off and he'd snooze. So what I would quite often do is, if it was someone who hadn't seen him for years, I would orchestrate that I was there at the beginning to break the ice. And then I would make my excuses, and I'd go I need to fill the car with diesel, or some pathetic excuse. And then I'd magically reappear when I thought that Simon was maybe running on empty. But also the other thing I did, and I really love this, and I've shared it with other people who've had sometimes even grandparents but in a hospice, is I got a colouring book, but I got a colouring book with different locations around the world so that his visitors could sit there and colour in and do a message for the children. So then it also meant when the kids went to see him, they went straight to the colouring book to see who he'd had and whether they'd left a message, and also it helped to educationally show the kids a bit of the world and all the rest of it.
It also is quite good mindfulness, isn't it, for the people that are sitting there? It gives them something to do. I often, I make a lot of notes when I'm doing these conversations, and I sometimes do because it's a distraction. It's helpful, isn't it?
Yeah. And I think especially for people who don't like to just sit and do nothing, and I think that definitely falls to a lot of Royal Marines. I don't think sitting and doing nothing is part of the job description, or not intentionally anyway. And so it did. Yeah, I can relate too in that crazy brain kind of way. I'm not very good at sitting still and doing nothing, which is probably why I came up with the idea, to be honest. And the hospice was amazing. So the kids colour in stuff, and he was allowed to blue tack pictures around the walls and stuff like that. So they were lovely. And then people used to ask me, Rosie, two different questions, and the answer was the same. People used to say to me, for starters, how did he live so long? Because when he got diagnosed in 2013, I thought he was only going to live 7 months. Living 2.5 years was just phenomenal, really. And then he was only horizontal for about 24 hours. So how he died so quickly as well is a bit of a mystery. And this is why I think it's really important to talk about dying, because I knew he had cancer, and I knew it was in his esophagus as his primary tumour, and I knew that it was spreading everywhere else, and I knew that maybe there was a little bit of a problem with his lungs by the time he got towards the end, because he was having a few issues with his lungs, and they thought that maybe there was some shading on the scans there as well. But I didn't know how he would stop living, biologically. And I suddenly realised that really mattered to me. No one had said to me how he'd die. And I know that sounds really bizarre, and I don't know whether that is my crazy brain again, but it kind of really bothered me not to know what to look for, not to know what was going to happen. And he started sleeping more and being awake less. But then the pivotal thing was he had the general come to visit him, and he was drinking gin and tonic with the general. And I think that he, and as you do in a hospice, you know, and I think that he'd been waiting to see him because I think he wanted him to say eulogy, and I think he wanted to ask him in person, and I think that he'd been waiting to see this guy so that he could ask him in person. But halfway through his time with him, he suddenly had a funny turn. And so I went out into the garden with General, and when the nurses came in, and he was sick and they tidied him up and stuff, and he wasn't normally sick. And so General was really worried it was his gin and tonic, and I was like, no, seriously, like he's been allowed a gin and tonic before. It's not the gin and tonic. You don't need to worry about the gin and tonic. You can give him double strength and he'd be fine. um and he looked at me and he said, he's really sick. And I was like, he's going to die. And that was the last visitor that Simon had who wasn't immediate family. That night, in the middle of the night, he woke up in pain. And he often used to wake up in pain. But the difference, Rosie, that night was normally he would insist on the minimum necessary to get him through to the morning. And this time that night, he was like, throw it all at me. I'm done now.
Yeah.
And he was just done. There was something in his brain. He'd done, and there was still one more person that he should have seen. And I'm still really sad that he never saw that person. But otherwise, he'd seen everyone. He'd had the conversations, and so they gave him everything. And then the next morning, I noticed his feet were blue, and I went through to the nurse and I said, I think he's dying. And they were like, don't be so silly. Because like the day before he'd been drinking gin with the General. Like, it's like, don't be so silly. I was like, no, I don't think he's right. I think his breathing's different. You know, he's insisted on sitting in the chair, but I don't think he's right. And then we got the children to come, and they were like, yeah, I think you might be right. So we showered him and bathed him and got the kids to come. And then he insisted on sitting in the chair. And my sister brought the kids. And oh, just the kids, like Rosie. I think the kids is the part that makes me the saddest.
And even now, I find it's anything connected to the kids, because that's what will bring me to my knees. You know, it's anything to do with them, because your job is to protect them from pain, and you cannot shield them from this.
And the nurses about 4 days before had said to me, have you told the children? And so I'd explained cancer to the kids at the very, very, very beginning, in the fact that everyone has 3 types of cancer. So the first type is like Granny and Mama, who've both had breast cancer, and they find it, and it's where the cells are naughty and they all lump together, and there's a lump of them, and they take the lump out, but they give them some really nasty medicine, which is called chemotherapy and radiotherapy. But they really only do it to hope that there's nothing else, because hopefully they're fine, and then they live their normal life and they're fine and they're over it. And then the second type is like Daddy's type, which is where you've got cancer, but it's either in too many places, or it's in too tricky a place to be able to take it out. So they give you the same kind of treatment with the chemotherapy and the radiotherapy and stuff, but the aim is just to keep you going as long as they possibly can. And of course, one of my kids turned around and said, what's the third? And I go, wait, you die. And then I was like, maybe that's a bit blunt. But part of being in wills and probate is I'd always known it's really important to use the right language with the kids. And also that sometimes what's in their head is actually more scary than the reality.
Yeah, this is something, again, that comes up time and time again. It's about using the really accessible, age-appropriate language and how much to tell them at what age. And it is a bit of a minefield, because you feel very harsh using such, you know, stark language to such young children. But the ambiguity, or kind of, I guess, false hope, is far more damaging than being open with them. And I genuinely think it's why my children have come through kind of as relatively unscathed as they have so far. Let's not tempt fate, because I think the open dialogue and the language, and not sort of closing off about the difficult conversations. I mean, we'd all rather not, wouldn't we? Let's be honest. But it is, again, it's a gift you can give your children, isn't it?
And I think one of the things that helped us is we're a military family. So like Remembrance had always been about Daddy's friends who get blown up and die, fighting and keeping us safe. So I've always been quite blunt with the kids. So it was just an extension of that. But about 3 or 4 days before, the nurse had taken me into a side room and said, have you had a conversation with the children? And do you know, Rosie, it's one of the only times in my life I've ever had an out-of-body experience. I literally felt like I was up on the ceiling watching like Coronation Street or something, with a nurse telling some poor young lady that her husband was going to die. It was really peculiar.
I remember it from when the police came to my house. Actually, I can remember actually thinking to myself, "Is I feel like I'm in Broadchurch. Like I feel like I'm on the telly in a BBC drama. Like watching this doesn't happen to people like me."
Mm. Yeah, really bizarre. And so I'd had a conversation with the girls and I tried to tell them, and my elder daughter had got it, but my younger daughter started to tell jokes. I just don't think she understood what I was trying to tell her. I'd bought these mugs and for the Jubilee, and I'd bought these mugs and I'd only bought 3, and they were like, "Why have you only bought 3?" And I was like, "Well, because I thought this is my moment. Got to seize it. The kids are in the puddle. Stay in the puddle with the kids." And I was like, "Well, I've only bought 3 because Daddy's not going to come home from the hospice girls." And and they were like, "But why is he not coming home?" And I said, "Well, you know, I told you about different types of cancer. Well, Daddy's cancer is now the type of cancer where he can't stay alive. The cancer's too much and he can't fight it anymore and he's going to die." And I was in floods of tears. And my elder daughter was like, "Mum, you're crying." And my younger daughter was just like, "So, Mummy," telling jokes. And I was just like, "Oh my good God, this is like chaos. Like, how's this
Yeah, children behave like psychopaths is also a common theme we're finding as well. It's just, it must be how they compartmentalise it. It must be. But at the time, you just think you've raised this absolute kind of Cuba that's devoid of feelings, but it's not. It's just how they process, isn't it?
And so then on that last day, at the moment where I thought he was going, I turned round to the medics and I said, "You need to phone his family, his mum, his sister, and his dad, because one of them was going to plan to come down that day." And I was like, "They all need to be told this is potentially the last time, and they all need to come because we think he's dying." And they said, "Well, you can do it." And I was like, "No, this needs to come from you, because then they'll know that how serious it is." So his mum, his dad, and his sister were on their way down. My sister, we washed him and all the rest of it. And he's such a stubborn raw marine, Rosie. So we'd washed him, and I was like, "What raw marine decides he even wants to be washed?" Like, but then they have a joke that the army are pongos because they don't wash as much as raw marines. So this raw marine, my lovely husband, decided he wanted to be washed. But I mean, he was so weak by the stage, I can't tell you. And this nurse was giving his feet a massage as an excuse to look at how blue they were. And she was agreeing with me and nodding at
Right.
me and stuff. And then I was like, "He wants to have a shower." And she turned around to me and she went, "Well, I'll shower him if you'll shower him." And I was like, "Yeah, all right, let's do it then." And so I was like, seriously, only a Royal Marine. And she was a little pocket rocket, this nurse as well. It wasn't one of the elder ladies. She was cute as anything. I was like, only a Royal Marine would have 2 women washing him in the shower in his last 24 hours. Like, seriously? Um, so we washed.
We talk about the gift of good death,
I
Emma.
know. So we washed him, and then he decided he wanted to try and eat, and he decided he wanted to have his pills if he could manage them, which was such an ordeal to watch him trying to do it. And then my sister rocked up with the kids, and I turned around to him and I said, "I think this is the last time you're going to see the kids, Simon." And that was horrendous. And I don't think the kids realised it was the last. Well, I know they didn't know that it was the last time they were going to see him. And should I have done it any differently? God, I just don't know, Rosie. I don't know. But it was lovely for him because they then went outside and you could hear them playing outside. And it was just when he called them his princesses and said his last words to them. And it was lovely. And then they went, and then his parents came, and then that's when it all went a bit horizontal, and he got moved to the bed, and then everything it just literally it just turned, and I think he knew he'd said goodbye. But oh my gosh, he was still made of strong stuff. So we all round his bed, and it got to like bedtime. So it was his mum, his dad, his sister and me, and I kept going out and sitting in the garden, and his dad came out and he was just like, "Are you not worried you're going to miss it?" And I was like, I've been with him, you guys haven't. You need some time with him. And I am slightly of the view that he's so stubborn that if he wants me there, he'll wait for me. If he doesn't, he's going to go when I go for a wee. He's just going to go when he wants to go, and it's not in my control. um And then it got to bedtime, and I was a little bit like, they'd put a bed next to his so I could sleep in the same room as him. I was like, do I get into bed with his family, like, all around me? Like, do? And then nurses in the hospice had managed to find spaces for everyone to go to sleep. So everyone agreed to go to sleep. And then in the middle of the night, he woke up in pain again. And again, he asked them to give him everything. And I knew it wasn't going to be very long. But then in the morning, he looked like he was rallying again. And I can't tell you, I just felt dirty with his family there and me in my pajamas. And they'd walk, I just felt, and I was like, you know what? It's my turn. I need to go and have a shower. So I picked up my wash kit and I went to go and have a shower, and I left them all with Simon. But it was quite down a corridor to get to the shower because I didn't want to use his bathroom in case anyone else needed a wee, or in case he suddenly needed something. So I was literally, I can't tell, I was naked in the shower. There's a bit of a theme here, Rosie. I was naked in the shower, the door banged, and it was my mother-in-law saying, Simon's calling for you and he wants you. And I was like, I'm naked. I'm not going to walk down the corridor in the hospice naked. I was like, I'm really sorry. I need to put some clothes.
I'll do anything for love, but I won't do that.
Yeah, I need to put some clothes on. And I can remember someone telling me that sometimes you do crazy stuff and you put your clothes on inside out. I was so methodical. Everything went on right. Everything went back in right. I didn't put any makeup on, but I put my perfume on because I remember consciously thinking he might be able to smell that. And I went back in, and he died probably about 20 minutes after I went back in the room with all of us there, or all the people that I presumed. But it's why I do what I do now, because I didn't ask him who he wanted in the room with him, and I just presumed. And there are questions. I thought we were as sorted as you can get, and there was still stuff that I didn't know. I didn't know if he wanted any music playing or didn't want music playing, or yeah. And then you kind of go into a free fall, don't you?
Well, I was going to ask if he has a big military funeral, because I imagine they take quite a bit of organising, and it's quite the fanfare and probably quite a welcome distraction from your own pain initially. But I know a lot of people find after the circus of the funeral, the memorial, they sort of realise that this is it now. And particularly if you have a husband who is abroad a lot and isn't necessarily there all the time. I'm just in my notes, I watched him whether the fact that he was military, whether, because he wasn't there all the time, whether it kind of took you longer to adjust to the fact that he'd permanently gone. But then I guess you weren't in touch with him. I don't know, it was just something that popped into my head of how that maybe impacts on the way that you begin to process grief.
100%, Rosie, 100%. So I think the funeral is fantastic because it gives you something to put your energy into. And my crazy brain needed a focus. I needed something to put my energy into. So the kids were booked into holiday club for most of July. And then in August, we'd planned stuff. And he died on the 11th of July. And so I turned around to the children and I said, you know what, if you go to holiday club and you go hang out with your friends, Mummy will do all the organisation while you're asleep or while you're at holiday club. And then when you're home, I'll be Mummy and I'll be with you. And I put all my energy, but also because it was a military funeral, I had help, and that was amazing. Like, I can't imagine navigating it all on my own. It was amazing having the help. My front room turned into a florist's. I literally was surrounded by flowers. And I think there were 500 people in the church. I did a eulogy, and I genuinely think that the denial I felt helped me. There's no way I could have organised the funeral. There's no way I could have done his probate. There was no way I could have stood up there in front of over 500 people and spoken for probably 20 minutes or so if I hadn't been in slight denial. It was like I was performing.
It's interesting to hear you describe it as a performance, because I can very much relate to this. Because of the nature of Ben's death, Ben's body was never found. So I held a memorial for him because I felt I very much needed to have this goodbye and this kind of end point to his life, I guess, because you know, you get people go, well, you know, you never know, there could be hope, and there wasn't any hope. And I felt that it's this American term closure, isn't it, that you do need to have it. And like you, my children attended, I spoke there. Like you, I have no clue how I did it, but somehow I did. And I'm very, very pleased that I did. And it is an important part of the process.
I think it's so important. But what you said about the military, I think is fascinating, because I do think it delayed my grief, because I think that, you know, I used to call it single parent mode. But when Si was away, and I mean, like when Olivia was born, he was away for 13 out of 18 months. You know, he was away in like 2, 4, or 6 week blocks, but he was away a huge amount. And then he weekly commuted and stuff. And so I think it really delayed it for all of us. And I was really shocked afterwards, because I turned around to work and been like, well, you know, I've had 2.5 years to get used to the fact that he's dying. So I'm sure I'll be back quite quickly. And I took loads of compassionate leave because I just wasn't ready. And although it wasn't a surprise, when he died, I was so shocked, Rosie. I was shocked that it had happened. I was shocked at my own reactions to it. And I don't know if you ever felt this at any point, but I physically felt heartbroken, like my heart was hurting.
Yeah.
Does that make any sense?
Yeah. Yeah. No, it absolutely does.
I don't know how to describe it, but I literally felt heartbroken. He and you were saying about the whole strength thing afterwards. Like, I do say to people, the gift having him in my world has given me is he's the first person who really helped me. And this is a whole nother subject for maybe another day, but he's the first person, I think, who saw all my crazy brain and loved me notwithstanding all my madness and all my crazy traits and all the rest of it. Whereas a lot of my life I've lived with feeling like I don't fit. But suddenly I felt like I did. And then the one person I did fit with, he wasn't there. So it was kind of more than soulmates. It was like the first time I'd been seen and been understood. And then he was gone. And I literally felt broken.
So what you hearing you say that actually has it's made me feel really sad, because I do relate to this idea that, you know, I have a crazy brain too. We talked about this a little bit before we came on mic, and both Emma and I have been diagnosed with ADHD since we lost our husbands. It actually isn't that uncommon, I'm finding, within the widow community. And I'm wondering whether this kind of I have no medical training, so this is pure speculation, but whether kind of it's either the kind of magnitude of the loss triggers something in your brain and you could no longer ignore it, or whether it comes about as a part of the sort of inward looking you're forced to do as part of being bereaved, because you do tend, many of us go into therapy, or you start to pick up on things. And I know how you feel, because Ben was my confidant, he was my, you know, support, he was my best mate, he was everything. And then suddenly they're gone, they're just gone. And you do feel, poor term of words, seeing as how my husband died, but you do feel cast adrift in an ocean with you don't know where to go.
And you really do. But it's fascinating, because the whole neurodivergence and grief thing, I think, is really fascinating, because as I mentioned to you before we came on, like I'm passionate about talking about it, because for me, I think the reason it came about is because I no longer had the energy to hide it. So all my life I've been trying to either be perfect, or I've been procrastinating and not getting anything done. But I've been trying to, in whatever way I can, hide who I really am and what my natural impulse is. You know, like, bless poor Rosie, like having two ADHD people have a conversation is a nightmare, because we're constantly interrupting. but it's part of who we are.
Not my first time.
It's like part of how we're built. You know, we have this amazing thought we want to say, and we want to say it, we want to say it now. But you know, like all my life.
Well, it's also not trusting your own.
Yeah. I know.
So we've just done it again. I just think it's like, you don't trust your own brain, because we know that we forget things. So if I don't say it now, it'll never get said. And it's just this burning desire to get the words out. I also am autistic, and I have an autistic son, and it was quite interesting watching how the two of us grieved, because we grieved very differently. I mean, obviously, a massive age difference as well. And I'm noticing that he, at the time, asked very matter-of-fact questions, but I'm now realising that perhaps there's still quite a lot of maybe locked-in grief. He's going to be 11 this year, so I am, exploring ideas for some sort of specialist therapy for him. And there is something I come across called Mind Jam, and they kind of do therapy with these children whilst they play Minecraft and online games. And they're all qualified therapists, and he's on the waiting list. But I'm very interested in this as an option for neurodivergent children. So I will report back when I've got a bit more knowledge on it. But yes, I completely agree. I think I was able to kind of contain this mask and, appear like everything was under control in the world. It wasn't. It was carnage in my own head. But then this happened, and I just couldn't do it
And the
anymore.
script of my life is feeling like I'm two different people. I'm the person everyone calls strong and amazing and inspirational, all the rest of it on the outside. And on the inside, like 90% of the time, I just feel baggage. I'm overthinking. I have horrendous rejection sensitivity. I feel totally disorganized.
Oh God, me too. Hey, you know what's great for rejection sensitivity? Doing a podcast.
Oh,
Well, actually, it has been great because it's really forced me to put myself out there and accept that not everybody is going to like who I am, and that's okay. But I have to say, it took a while to build up to it.
yeah, massive. But I think I just didn't have the energy to hide who I was anymore. And 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 I was starting to blame myself for some of the stuff that was happening in our family home, because I am scatty, I do hyper focus, I lose track of time. And then what's fascinating with my younger daughter, and she is happy me sharing a little bit of it, but for the last 18 months, she was one of the really unfortunate kids who in lockdown never really got to be the top of the school. And then lockdown finished and she went from primary into secondary, and it just blew her brains and she didn't know what to do about it. And I think there's a lot of kids like that anyway. But what you're saying about the processing of grief, I find really fascinating, because a lot of her behavioral issues have been put down to grief and trauma, and the fact that because she was the younger one and because she didn't listen or didn't hear or didn't comprehend or have the understanding when I was saying that daddy was not going to come home and daddy was going to die, she was the one, when I told them that daddy had died, that I cannot explain the noise she made. It will haunt me forever. She just collapsed and wailed. And then she double checked with me that evening when we got home, like, is daddy coming home from the hospice? No, sweetheart, daddy's died. And then she did the same and collapsed again. Yet it was only last June, Rosie. So after Father's Day last June, that school phoned me up on the Monday at lunchtime and said, we think you need to pick her up. She's really upset. And amazingly, she'd gone into school, because school attendance has been a struggle for her. And I went and collected her, and she turned around and she said, I've just realised he's not coming back. I was like, oh my God, it's been 6 years.
Oh, poor baby.
It's been 6 years.
Yeah.
And I think,
and I have to say, I can relate to that feeling of suddenly that realization that actually they are not coming back and there's nothing that you can do about it. And it does sometimes stop me in my tracks, and I'm a 40-something-year-old woman, so no wonder these poor babies have difficulty getting their heads around the enormity of it and the finality of it.
But what's been fascinating is, for me, the grief exposed my neurodivergence, and I feel almost like I will always carry this sadness of Simon's death with me forever in my heart. But it's given me the liberty to be my true self and be me, and I'm embracing it and I'm loving it.
Yeah.
But for her, the grief hid her neurodivergence. Everyone put it down to behavioural problems with grief. Everyone was like, poor child, she's not got a dad. And it is only now, she's 13, that we're getting her assessed for autism. And I think that's her. I think that's what's going on for her. I think she is a good kid struggling to cope with her surroundings. And I think a lot of our children, when they're grieving and they're acting out, it comes from a place of fear or not understanding, or because fundamentally, I believe we're good, and when we act out, we're acting out because we're struggling with what's going on in our life. Um, but
There's the term, isn't there, that every reaction or every action has a cause or something like that. And generally, you're right. People aren't bad. They don't behave badly for fun. There's normally something happening under the surface. And also hearing you talk about sort of finding your true self as a result of having been hurtled onto this roller coaster ride we never signed up for. And I agree, because without Ben's death, and this is not me saying it's a positive thing, of course it's not, is I would never have kind of gone in. I would never have stopped drinking alcohol. I would never have gone on this journey of, I'm nearly 2 years in therapy. And for many people say, well, that's far too expensive. Well, guess what? So is 2 bottles of wine a day. You pick what you spend your money on. And for me, the investment in my healing and finding out that I have this neurodivergence has given me permission to be myself. And as an adult who found out as an adult that they were autistic, I would like to just thank you for doing this for your daughter, because just help, even if she just knows who she is, she will be so much more comfortable in her own skin, and you will be able to help her better. So I know that's a little off topic, but I just wanted to say that to you.
We've gone privately because Sophie, despite the fact that her issues affect her school attendance, Sophie was told by CAMS, "You're not suicidal, you don't need drugs." Although I actually would question the drugs because she's got really high anxiety. So they wouldn't see her. So we've paid to go privately, but it has been worth every single penny for her to understand her world, and for the
Yeah,
grown-ups and adults in her life to better know how to communicate with her. I hadn't realised how overwhelming
yeah.
living in the world is for her, and it makes me so sad to realize that the last 6.5, nearly 7 years, I haven't been able to help her more because I haven't understood what's going on.
But you're doing it now, and it's very difficult. I know when I told my mum that I'd been diagnosed, she was sort of felt terrible guilt that they didn't know, because I had quite a turbulent teenage years, and knowing this would probably have made everything better. But if they didn't even quantify ADHD as a condition in girls until 1998 to begin with, and then we look different. People often say to me, "Oh, you don't look autistic." It's become a bit of a joke, actually. So it is. We hide in plain sight. Now, Emma, before I say goodbye to you today, I just wanted to mention something else that you've done with your grief, which is pretty special and amazing. And you retrained, didn't you, as a grief and trauma counsellor, and you've set up a company which helps people navigate kind of the boring side of death, which nobody really talks about. There is a lot of admin when somebody dies, and more so if they don't have a will or provision in place, which sadly does happen a lot, even when people have terminal illness, but primarily when people die suddenly. And I experienced it myself. Ben had he had life insurance, but he needed to be dead to get it, and I didn't have a proof of death certificate. But that's another story. But things like Ben was divorced, and he changed his will, so everything went to his mum in the event of his death. And thankfully we were married, so it kind of superseded it. But these are just things that when you're young and you're just going about living your life, you've got young kids, they're not things that you think about. But they are actually so essential. And I think that the work you're doing on this is really, really valuable.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, it does come from a little bit of a tree hugger part of me, which feels like it's my destiny. Like, I was a wills and probate lawyer. I've always been fascinated in mental health. I'm now a widow. I've experienced, sadly, 2 deaths, one being Simon's and one being that riding accident. And I just feel that, in my job, I used to only see people who had been triggered by something to come and do their will. So either they were elderly, or they were going on holiday, or they'd had a terminal illness, or they'd heard that someone else had been poorly. But actually, since I've been in the widowed community, and I'm sure, what you said just resonates, that you get this too. But I've just seen that we can't necessarily make the pain of the emotions any better, because your grief is as unique and as deep as the love that you had for the person who's not there, and I really passionately believe that. But we can make all the shit and the admin that's around it just a little bit easier by being prepared. And it is sadly the people who don't know what to do about guardians, or who die really suddenly, or something like that, who actually need to get it sorted. So basically, anybody over 18 needs to sort their shit out,
Yeah.
really. And I
It's
don't
not,
necessarily just do their will and their power of attorney. Tell people, who's going to look after the dog, and like
yeah.
all the extra bits and bobs that make all the difference. Where to find stuff? Like, how many people search around unable to find stuff?
Even PIN codes, how do you access things like their phone? I knew Ben's PIN code. Did I know it 48 hours after he died? No, because I had widow brain in it, and I still don't know it. We never had the conversation. I suppose had he died in an accident of some kind, I probably would have had his ashes scattered in the sea, because that's where he loved to be. So I take a little bit of comfort. That's where he is anyway. Now, I am going to put a link to your rainbow hunting, because I think a lot of people who are sort of floundering around will find it very beneficial. And actually, the admin doesn't stop. 5 years in, I occasionally still get letters addressed to Ben, and even just seeing one of those letters arrive it's a real trigger, because it's a blast out of the blue, isn't it, that you're not expecting. But on that note, Emma, I have kept you for ages. This is what happened. You get two neurodivergent women chatting. There's the longest
I
podcast in the
know.
world.
I've been quite conscious of that.
No, don't be conscious, because it's been so lovely. I haven't wanted to stop. I really could chat to you all day, and I definitely think that we will have another conversation again, because you're fascinating, and getting the insight into the military side of grief, and how differently it impacts both them and you, and it was lovely hearing about the support you got from the military actually as well. That was really, really nice to hear.
And I am fully aware that not everybody, Rosie, does get that support. And like, my heart goes out to the people who don't. And if you don't get that support from the military itself, there are charities and there are places that you can find the support, and there are people you can speak to try and do it. But I do feel very fortunate that, yeah, we were very lucky.
And I think you were very lucky to have each other for the time you did. I wish you'd had longer, because he sounds like a really, really awesome dude, and I wish that you and your girls had him around for longer. But this is what brings us to this place. So yeah, it's been wonderful to talk to you, and I wish you all every happiness as you continue to rebuild your lives.
Thank you, and to you, lovely. Thank you so much. It's just been so lovely, and I can't thank you enough for what you guys do. I really believe that in sharing our stories, we help other people to feel seen and to feel heard. And so I think what you guys do is just amazing. So thank you.
Thank you. We're very proud of it. And for everybody else, you know the drill. Take care of yourselves, and we'll be back on Friday.